So welcome everybody from all over the world to this fourth MDPI webinar on COVID-19. Today we talk and discuss about global supply chains and the SDGs. We have the honor to have three top experts joining us. Dr. Dorothea Schostok, a very active young researcher I have met for the first time during the World Sustainability Forum 2017 in Cape Town from the Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy. Her work focuses on the analysis on development of sustainability strategies, corporate social responsibility and sustainability governance, as well as on the research areas of corporate and economic development. Then we have Professor Paul Walsh. I have been in touch on social media for years, full professor of international development studies and member of the governing authority in University College Dublin. Patrick is the director of the UCD Center for Sustainable Development Studies, coordinator of the UCD PhD in Global Human Development, which trains academic staff in East African universities up to a PhD level across several subject areas. Patrick is also a senior advisor to the UN SDSN Network New York. And last but not least, Professor Max Bergman, a very old friend of mine from the University of Basel. Max is chair of social transitions research counselor of the Swiss National Science Foundation, and member of the Uganda National Academy of Sciences and the Sustainable Development Solution Network. He is president of the Swiss Academy Society for Environmental Research and Ecology, SAGUF, section editor-in-chief of Sustainability Journal and editor-in-chief of World. He chairs the World Sustainability Forum and the Basel Sustainability Forum since 2014. So the format today, we will present two talks followed by a pre-discussion before answering your questions. If you are a researcher and interested to submit a paper in one of our supporting journals, please get in touch with us. A list of open special issues will be available on the webinar website. And now I have the honor and privilege to pass the word to Patrick. Please go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm very happy to talk and share the stage here with Max and Dorothy on talking about COVID-19, and particularly just looking at, I just want to shine a little bit of a spotlight on global supply chains. And even before pre-COVID, I was pretty concerned that we were not looking at global supply chains and the ability of the SDGs actually to be achieved by the year 2030. But I do think COVID-19 gives us that little bit extra, as it does on so many things. It seems to give a 3D scan on, you know, all the sort of frailties and fractures and strains that we have in society, economies and governments. So we're going to take this up, hopefully this webinar will take that opportunity to look at this in a little bit of detail and motivate a debate. So hopefully I'm not making it up that there is a problem with global supply chains, but the World Bank, I think, have a very nice database on this that they have up, particularly I've given you a link there to focus in on medical supplies and food supplies during COVID, and it is quite interesting that they feel it necessary to look at it not just by country and not just two-way flows by country, but to do it by product categories, down to the detail level of even masks, if you know what I mean, for COVID, right? Medical supplies. And they also are very concerned about, obviously, oligopolies and the fact that there is a concentration of just a few companies who are responsible for these trade flows. So that's the sort of background to my talk, is that we're, you know, even the World Bank is already monitoring data on these policies and trade flows. I'm worried about our food supplies, and not just to the Northern Hemisphere, we're back down into the Southern Hemisphere as well, right? So they see it as a big risk. So what I want to do is to go pre-COVID in a sense, and to try and convince you that actually it's a major issue for the SDGs that we have production, or the production of goods and services, very much organized around global supply chains at the moment. So in a sense, production has gone very international and multinational, right? And in a very complex way, both through food systems, medical systems, mobile phones, and all sorts of technologies, so on. And I guess what I want to not pick on, but we do say, and I've said it, the SDG is a global agenda for local action. And we do say that. But I actually just want to question that a bit today, given the power of these global supply chains that push, I'm going to make a case that they push, you know, most of the value added, or the $1 trillion global economy that we see. And also, I'm worried that they're primarily responsible for exploiting and causing persistence in our income inequalities across nations. And also, they're quite responsible for what's happening to the environment in terms of using the earth or natural resources as a source, but also using the environment as a sink for what they're doing. So I'm going to obviously put a lot of it, try to show you that I think that we have to focus on maybe we need a global approach and a multilateral approach, and maybe a whole of global society approach informed by science and led by governments. And it's a different type of multilateralism, but we do have to get on top of the multinational structure that global supply chains have, right? So this is the outline of my talk. So I'll first just try and motivate why these global supply chains have emerged, particularly in the last bit of the 20th and obviously increasingly so in the first 20 years of the 21st century. And then I'm just going to look at matters arising, and particularly a bit concerned about the sort of oversight, the way we actually have a monitoring review, as we call it, of the SDGs. But I am going to give a bit of hope that we have written a paper how maybe the HLPF and the UN can actually be a better convener of a global stakeholder partnership to actually solve this type of problem. I'm also going to raise concern about the MOIs, like if we are transforming these global value chains, and we're going to start looking at the data needed to do that, thinking about the technology change that's needed, thinking about the capacities and partnerships and the finance structures, that again, we're not thinking interstate, and we're not thinking about in terms of products and services that go across nations. We tend to be within nation. And of course, that cripples us in terms of being able to achieve the SDGs. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the transformational pathways that the Global Sustainable Development Report came out with, which are great. I mean, they give 6 very clear transformations that we've to target. They give us 4 very clear levers or MOIs that we have to look at. But the problem is that again, it seems to be within nation that's the focus. And I think we have to be across nations and particularly focus in on transformations of these global supply chains and to put them on a different pathway to economic prosperity that is more inclusive for global society and better for the global commons, okay? And that it is an effort by all nations and all people, but we have to find a way to reignite multilateralism. We cannot just do it on our own and hope that it all adds up to success, because this is not going to happen, okay? I have a lot of slides, but they say something to me, okay? So the first thing is that as an economist, when I look at GDP per capita or value added per person or even by worker, I mean, it is quite remarkable how this has gone up exponentially since World War II, right? And of course, we can start looking at how have humans got so productive, and we can think of all the different industrial revolutions, but particularly using capital and then technology, and now using AI and all sorts of brilliant technologies. I mean, they are certainly behind the human ability you know, to use basic raw materials and to generate massive productivity and massive efficiency and value added for the global economy, right? And, you know, in a sense, it's that economic growth that I think is putting so much stress on the global commons, environmental commons. And of course, people might point to population, but yes, there's population growth. But I think what we can see here, again, we're also good at dynamics and COVID at this stage when we're looking at cases and growth of cases, etc. We looked at first, second moments. we can see that population growth is on the down. So we do have to be concerned, obviously, for 9 or 10 billion people that we have to feed them and make sure they've got nice water quality and good air quality. But really, it's reform of the economic system is the focus. I firmly believe that we are getting progress, like in the General Assembly in September, great progress on getting universal access to healthcare, but particularly reproductive healthcare. The thing that I want to point out to you, though, since World War II, the issue with population is actually the age structure. Because in the Northern Hemisphere, we're tending to have to be getting older, right? So while the Southern Hemisphere could have, 60% of its population under the age of 25 in a lot of countries, which could be good news for COVID for those countries, the Northern Hemisphere is a much older population and an aging population. The only problem is they're a rich population. And what we're seeing is, in terms of the global economy, most of the wealth and assets and the procurement of income and value added from those assets is accruing to the Northern Hemisphere and to those older populations. So it's the top billion is where the market is and where the money is. So what I wanted to do, and of course we know the global picture, I think CO2 emissions is a good measure of ocean health. It's a good measure of land, what's happening on land, the deforestation. So it's a good barometer for the whole global commons, and we can see the earth indeed is getting warmer, and we can see the countries that have, again, in the latter half of the 20th and the early half of the 21st century are driving the carbon emissions. So how, in my mind, do I think what's after happening to the global economy? Well, it goes back to John Sutton in the London School of Economics, who with Shackett wrote a paper when I was doing my PhD. This paper has always stuck with me, and it's on natural oligopolies. And it's one of the few papers in economics that actually allows for income inequality. So you can have people on the lowest income, A here, people on the highest income, B. This is not time, now this means income in their paper. And of course you can have a distribution of people, but this is a uniformly distributed consumer base, but you can have any shape you wanted to, just to make it simple. But so the paper allows for income inequality. So this is like we have rich people in the Northern Hemisphere and poor people in the Southern Hemisphere. Also, when people buy products, and particularly people with money, they don't just look at price. They look at a thing called quality. And this quality index is made up of sets of product characteristics. Like, so we're taking a very industrial organization approach here. So a car is not just a car. A car is the engine size. It's got 4 doors. It's got colors. It's got all sorts of product characteristics in its tires and its everything. But basically, consumers know what's a good product. They know what the best phone is, what the best car is, what the best piece of clothing is. And for that reason, in this very simple model of consumer choice and demand, they play a 3-stage game where they compete in price in the 3rd stage, on quality, or they invest with R&D and with lots of things. They invest in the quality aspect, even advertising, and then they have an entry game in stage 1. And what comes out of this framework is a very general result, which says is that if you have a situation where the top billion people have the money and they have a demand for a particular set of product characteristics, the market over time will evolve only to have 2 or 3 companies. And those 2 or 3 companies will target that's in our case here, the Northern Hemisphere, and that whole of the production in the world, all the supplies and labor, all the factors of production, etc., they will orientate themselves to that market, right? And what you'll have as byproduct, you will have only 2 or 3 companies dominating globally, and it's all about focusing on getting the products to market and getting the sales and value added into those countries. Sutton himself focuses on the traditional terms of trade issue, where he basically shows, well, look, the poor countries are exporting the intermediate parts or low quality products, and the rich countries tend to be exporting the high products, even though there is 2-way trade. But I prefer to look at it from 2 different perspectives. One is you can actually go into values of companies. And so we've had our first $2 or $3 trillion companies in the tech sector, obviously Microsoft, etc. But you can actually look at the global market share of all your favorite products and services, and you will see a dominance of 2 or 3 companies globally. And this should worry you, right? Because the whole idea, obviously, is to restrict output to get a high price and to target a particular market. And this is what we mean by natural oligopolies have emerged. And even in their terms, to say, as the market actually gets bigger, this problem gets worse, right? In the sense that these oligarchs or these oligopolies start to dominate more. And of course, they've raised huge concerns for us, of course, in medical supplies and food at the moment. This is taken from the Global Sustainable Development Report, which just again points out that this has kind of caught us blindside a little bit, because this really has escalated in terms of free movement of people and capital and goods and services and financial flows, etc. Like, and then the onset of technologies and intellectual property and etc. Like, this is the digital age has really come at us late in the 20th century, and in the last 20 years has really escalated, right? So in terms of our connectiveness across the world, this issue of trade and capital and people wrapped around a new age of the fourth revolution technology has really escalated in the last few decades. And even when we talk about, normally if you look at a nation state and they look at their pathway to decarbonization, they normally will look at land use, particularly say agriculture, then they'll talk about transportation, and they'll talk about energy transitions. But again, for me, what's important is look at global transportation. Look at the cargo ships at the moment, right? A lot of the cargo ships are not able to dock. You've got crew that are moving all our goods and services, but actually they're not able to get on land. And this is not sustainable. And of course, there's organizations negotiating 12-step plans that these type of workers can dock and get home, etc. But that's a problem. I mean, our transportation system that underpins our whole supply network has been a bit fractured by the fact that the COVID and restrictions on the movement of people in and out of countries, etc. But even our energy systems, the way we think about that, the transformations have to go interstate. They are not intrastate, like a lot of people seem to suggest, right? The FAO have been on top of this issue right from the beginning of COVID, with huge concerns over the sort of quality and the speed at which food is coming out of Africa and how it's getting through distributors and into retail stores. And of course, COVID is changing for health reasons of workers and other things, is changing every step of that. But also the other way around, the lack of remittances and money and financial flows going into the developing world is seriously, and their reaction to an onslaught of COVID is also going to undermine the ability of these countries to produce food and to stay food secure, etc. But they've been very nice, frequently asked questions, and I put that up there about all the different concerns they have about the food supply chain. So just in terms of this point, forgetting about the HLPF or forgetting about the SDGs, how would you normally go about dealing with these the monopolistic or oligopolistic structure in global supply chains? Well, the first best policy from my point of view is a global institution for competition policy and regulation. And of course we don't have that, right? We have quite weak international institutions, and we certainly don't have that for competition policy. A second best approach is some sort of coordinated policy, let's say an industrial policy across nations. Like that would say, for example, you know, when a value chain lands in your country, maybe you should ask them to adhere to the principles of responsible investment along their supply chain, and that they should give you evidence that they have been careful about human rights abuses, etc., and about environmental issues right across their outsourcing and their supply chain. Maybe they should have a sustainable development plan, you know, sustainable development reporting, etc. So in Ireland, for example, we've always asked the multinationals, you know, to have a social aspect to what they do in Ireland, like hire people, pay them well, give them medical insurance, all that sort of thing. But then we should also be asking them to not just look after environmental issues in Ireland, but to make sure that there isn't footprints like water, waste, carbon, or any sorts of environmental footprints along their supply chain. Now, of course, this could be very useful, but it's up to all countries to kind of coordinate that, to actually discipline the supply chains that are operating across nation, but it's hard to coordinate that. In general, the other way forward could be not on the production side, could be on the consumption side, where consumers would be asked, and governments are consumers as well of a lot of capital projects, that they should be asked to, the consumer should ask the companies in the retail stores to account for their global footprints. Let's call them SDG footprints. And that could obviously start a revolution as well, but this is not an easy thing to do either. But it's a focus of many projects, let's say, in the northern hemisphere. Third best policy will be tariffs, right? So obviously what Trump is trying to do, even with medical supplies and even with pharmaceuticals, et cetera, he's trying to bring them home to America, right, with tariff structures. But you could imagine using tariff structures strategically, like a carbon tax or something like, to punish value chains that are not adhering to the SDGs. But these are the sort of policy options that you have, right? In this paper, it's just a chapter in a book, we highlight the fact that, you know, more could be done at the HLPF, in the sense that there's a beautiful UN General Assembly Resolution A67290, which allows non-governmental stakeholders to participate, obviously, in the review of the SDGs every year in HLPF and its subcommittees of the HLPF, like the SDI Forum and Youth Forums, et cetera. But there's a sense here that the UN, now that it has the private sector involved, say through the academic compact, the UN compact, it has the private sector at the table. It has academics, it has the scientists, it has all the NGO groups, etc., and it has leaders and it has ministers. And they could do more to induce a different type of multilateralism and to try and get at this issue of transnational movements, like through transportation, through energy, systems, through economic systems, etc., and actually really focus on trying to give the soft power of the UN, just to give it that little bit more meat, right? Because at the moment, it's the voluntary national reviews that have that a little bit, but again, they're within nation. They're not talking about this collective action that's actually needed to tackle COVID, obviously, but also to tackle climate change and ocean health, etc. But one of the big problems is changing the economic system, which has really been governed by these global supply chains. So again, I just want to talk a bit about the MOIs, right? So the UN 2030 agenda has means of implementation. In the document, it's clear, the goals, so it has 4 sections. The preamble is the vision, you have the goals and the targets, you have the MOIs, and you have the follow-up and review. Now the MOIs, again, we tend to tackle them within nation or across nations, even transfers and technology across nations. But in this paper, we really asked the question, what is the nature of technology in these global supply chains? And how come 80% of the value added generated by these supply chains actually goes to a thing called, what economists call the solar residual, or total factor productivity, or a catch-all technology, right? So it seems like Joe Stiglitz used to talk about this, saying, you know, the owners of land, the owners of capital, the owners like raw materials, like seed, fertilizers, they're not getting a good rate of return, but yet someone is getting 80% of the value added. And these are the owners of the technology, the digital highways and the technology. They know how to control the global supply chains. And we argue that this is not the type of technology we need for inclusive societies globally and for sustainable and global environment issues. So there's a big challenge here, even if we're to think about how do we actually change these global supply chains with the different types of data that the World Bank are grappling with now. How are we going to do it with the different financial models or regulatory models, incentivize things? How are we actually going to get at them through finance capacities, etc.? It's another way of thinking. If that's the problem behind the SDGs failing, it's outside the nation state, and it has to be done on a multilateral level with all stakeholders, though, not just governments, because they're not powerful enough. So the last point then, and I'll stop, is that unfortunately, we know the SDG is about linkages. We know it's across nations. We know it's a global agenda. We know it's about linkages. And people like who wrote down the wedding cake or donut economics and these things, again, they like to split things into biospheres and society and economy. But the truth is that they're all in it and interlinked, and that this is not helpful to do this sort of framework. It's in the same way that when we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking of the global commons, you really have to see how the oceans and the forests, the lands and the climate are actually interacting and why they're interacting, right? And of course they interact with human agency as well now through the economy and through society. But the SDGs is this very much globally interlinked agenda. And that's why when we're looking at pathways to the SDGs, and we look at these key transformations that we need in human well-being and sustainable just economies, energy transitions, food systems, this is the Global Sustainable Development Report, and the governance and the means MOIs, the economy and finance and the science and the data, etc. I would argue this has to be a lot of this is transnational. And this is where we're failing. We're not looking at this enough. So finally, you know, unfortunately, when we're doing global supply chains and we're worried about health and we're worried about energy, renewable energies, and we're worried about food security and ocean health, it's complex. But the one thing we could zone in on, and in terms of coming out of this crisis and in terms of reforming something, I think we could take a good hard look at global supply chains and their dominance in economic activity and the sort of consequences they have for global society, global governance, and the global commons, the environmental commons. Okay, I'll stop there. And thank you for the invitation again.
Okay, so thank you very much, Patrick. So I will immediately go to Doro.
It's a pleasure to join you today. Yeah, if we understand the crisis as a climax and turning point of a dangerous development, then we can refer it to as a corona transformation, and then we can learn from it. Then we can ask ourselves, what do we gain from all the losses? We may wonder whether COVID-19 is changing our lives in a direction we already wanted to go, namely towards a sustainable world, the journey of which we have already begun 2015 with the 17th Sustainable Development Goals. Here we are, okay. So if we understand the corona crisis as a window of opportunity, if we understand it as a transformation instead of a crisis, then we can move forward. Today, we already see and feel the first positive side effects. And in order to have enough discussion time later, we cannot go into detail in all SDGs, but I would like to give you an overview along the 5 Ps whereby I have changed the assignment in favor of the storyline. So let's start with people and the SDGs 3. Something is not working perfectly here. Here we are. Okay. With health, our well-being also comes in for, and we learn that our well-being must be satisfied in a different way today. Compared to our practiced lifestyle and consumption patterns, families are spending more time together now than ever before, and we are happy to have time for the family beside the multiple burden and quality time, which we have wished for so long on the continuum of work-life balance. What we gain is time, the non-renewable resource of our lives, time that the health system and the care system needs to flatten the curve of the infection rate, time to reflect, time to question our lifestyle. What is really important to me, and do I want to design my life differently? Yeah, and despite closed doors, the educational offer does not stand still. With a lot of solution orientation, inventiveness, and creativity, diverse and comprehensive e-learning platforms have been created in a very short time, and we see it works. Not everywhere with the same high level of technology, but basically it works. And one of the 5 cornerstones of the Agenda 2030 is leave no one behind. And this is exactly what we are experiencing today. It's social cohesion, community spirit, and solidarity. Okay, let's move on to planet. SDG 6. The most important hygiene measure against the spread of COVID-19 is wash your hands. Through a continuous routine, we can all win in the long term because regular hand washing also helps to reduce the spread of other viruses. In the Western world, we have sufficient resources for this, clean water and soap. However, with regard to the countries of the global south, we must stand firm if the epicenters shift. The resources, water and soap, are not available everywhere and in sufficient quantities. And we see worldwide 3 billion people cannot wash their hands properly at home. And this is the point where financial infrastructure and logistical help is needed. We see just a few weeks after the shutdown, the water quality has improved greatly. This is a picture of the nice canals. They are clean, and even in the harbor basin of the Sardinian capital, Cagliari, we see dolphins playing. We see the air quality has improved significantly as well, referring to SDG 11. We have to admit that home office and the shift of business travel to telephone and video conferencing is largely successful, as we see today. So this must become a consistent business practice to protect the environment and to save money. We see greenhouse gas emissions have steadily decreased since the shutdown, and Germany and possibly other countries will achieve their GHG reduction targets for 2020. However, this must not remain a one-time effect, and rebound effect must be avoided. Referring to SDG 7, we know that a key driver of GHG emissions is the energy industry. And yeah, but 840 million people worldwide do not have stable access to electricity, which means that even hospital facilities can just work to a very limited extent due to the lack of energy. And two key aspects for a future strategy in SDG 7 are independent, decentralized renewable energy systems and future programs for local empowerment. If we have a look to prosperity and SDG 9, we see that seldom has the creative destruction caused by the implementation of new combinations, with which Joseph Schumpeter coined the term innovation as early as 1934, gained as much importance as today. We need innovative solutions to tackle the pandemic across industries and sectors. And automation and digitalizations are just two of the key concepts here. In order to release the creative power, new combinations will begin by replacing the others, depriving them of their means of production and thus leading to an elimination of competition for old products and business models. In macroeconomic terms, this process of creative destruction explains the creation of innovation and this simultaneous displacement of something old. So macroeconomically speaking, creative destruction is the Meyer factor of business fluctuation. It is an eternal storm that occurs in a discontinuous but a steady manner. And this storm is the driving force of change, the foundation of the innovation, the engine of the economy and its development. However, the innovations must not be seen as a refuge from the Schumpeterian storm of competition, but as a worldwide justification for competitive advantages. We need to find answers on how long-term growth and investment programs can provide economic support to sectors weakened by the pandemic, while at the same time promoting long-term resource conservation and climate protection. And the key is green recovery. This opens up an opportunity not only to trigger economic impulses, but also to set clear priorities in terms of sustainable and robust design of the economy and society. And the technology pathways of a green and future-oriented recovery plan, which boost the economy and employment, include, among other things, for example, the energy-related renovation and insulation of houses, the conversion of steel production to hydrogen-based green production processes, the entry into a green hydrogen economy as a whole, the successive but consistent closing of material cycles within the framework of a circular economy, the electrification of transport, the complete change to an entirely renewable power and energy supply, and the consistent use of digitalization as an enabler for the central transformation areas of our time, such as energy, mobility, industrial, urban, consumption, and food transition. Here, economy and environment are not enemies, but rather stimulating partners. They are a symbiosis of a resilient and sustainable system, and that has to be the credo. Otherwise, non-climate neutral investments will lead to negative implications and thus further to costs, to more costs even. Now is the time to seize this opportunity to realign our energy and economic system. And to follow up on Paul's keynote speech, we must, wherever the geographically decentralized value chains driven by globalization are at all reasonable. Let us consider, for example, the relocation of jobs abroad, highly greenhouse gas and resource-intensive supply chains, partly unbalanced dependency relationships, and more than questionable social and quality standards. We should look at good examples of companies that already have relocated large parts of their production site back to the home country to see how regional supply and value chains can be set up. And in addition, we must fundamentally change our thinking in relation to global value change, develop strategies for how we can substantially establish complete value change in other countries instead of seeing them as simple suppliers and thus exploiting their human and national capital. If we have a look to the SDG index report, we will mostly likely see a positive shift next year. The countries on the left side, here, for example, the OECD countries, the countries which have a lot of catching up to do in terms of ecologically driven SDGs, they will gain points and change from red to yellow or even green. However, we have to be careful that countries with problems in the area of social SDGs do not take a step backwards, for example, because of current lacks of vaccinations against tuberculosis, measles, polio, the lack of preventive medical checkups, or increasing domestic violence, just to name a few issues. If we act now wisely, with foresight, solidarity, partnership, and goodwill, we may end up not only stopping the pandemic, but also achieving the SDGs. And just to be clear in the end, this impulse should not ignore the health, social, or economic risks and burdens. I want to encourage that one day a new and perhaps a better normal awaits us. Sometimes it's precisely the break with routines that release our sense of the future, the idea and the certainty that everything could be completely different, even for the better. Thanks a lot for your attention.
I will try to be as succinct as possible. These are two very challenging presentations to comment, not only in the next hopefully less than 10 minutes, but also if I had an hour. I'm actually quite struck by both presentations, because it seems to me that both presentations outline how, if everything goes really well, how wonderful solutions could actually take place. So in some sense, they actually engage with the COVID situation and supply chains in ways that I'm looking very hard, not for an expression that goes beyond wishful thinking, because I don't want it to sound this hard. I can't think of something right now. But I really don't mean to make it as harsh as a critique. I mean, maybe I'll start with the second presentation. It started intriguingly with the many good news that COVID-19 has actually brought, and that is really hard for me to actually listen to, because I mean, while we do know that some dolphins have been sighted in some areas, for every single SDG that I can think of, COVID has actually is about to and will bring terrible consequences. I mean, we can talk about poverty in terms of mass unemployment or underemployment and the consequences across the globe. When we know that in terms of hunger, number two, we know that food supply chains are already being threatened, that American farmers are plowing their harvests back into the ground. And we know that not only in the US, but also in India or in many other Asian countries, we have food lines in Geneva that are hundreds of meters long. This is the first time for a very long time in Switzerland that we actually have people picking up food packages. I could go through the whole thing. I don't have to go through SDG 3 and the health-related issues. We read that every day. So it's actually really interesting to see also the silver lining in what COVID actually does to the SDGs. I do take the point of the Schumpeter's ideas. And a lot, the second part of the second presentation then actually was strongly focused on the necessity for solidarity to use this crisis as an opportunity, or maybe not even to see this crisis as a crisis, but as an opportunity. I have the feeling that all the papers that I read, the discussions that I follow, the tweets and the comments that I follow seem to go in the opposite direction of solidarity. And I think it's the EU's reaction to the coronavirus, I mean, is a really case in point in how disappointing solidarity has worked in a union that should have been probably the strongest model of solidarity. And it's not working, not in the member countries, it's not working within countries. And so I'm a little bit at a loss of how to categorize the presentation to what I read and what I observe daily. The first presentation, moving very quickly to the first presentation of really two very fascinating presentations, is very interestingly also an argument that the global supply chains have not worked in the past. I completely agree that this is not just a coronavirus issue. These are things that have already taken place, we could argue for decades. And there's a similarly an interesting argument for the necessity for better multinational and multilateral solutions. And again, I see actually the dynamics, the global dynamics, but also national, regional dynamics to actually move exactly in the opposite direction. I see a diversification of suppliers, and the diversification of suppliers will create even more uni and bilateral solutions. They will create much more of a wheeling and dealing between, okay, if I give you access to this raw material, what I want from you in return is X and Y. And so I do see a very strong regionalization of supply chains, but I actually fear that. And the funny thing is, I do not belong to the kind of economics that would actually argue that markets are self-correcting and global supply chain should be unregulated. But what I see in localizing or regionalizing supply chains, reducing, are actually quite tremendous and frightening consequences. I give you an example. I mean, will the consumers basically be willing or able to pay for the extra price that it will take to maybe make shoes in Switzerland. You know, maybe we don't need Chinese shoes. Maybe we have enough people that we could employ. Would people be willing to pay for the kind of products that are necessary to have local or regional supply chains? Will the wealthy countries be willing to take on the kind of environmental destructions that we have externalized? There are many, many other issues that I can imagine where there is an attractiveness about maybe truncating supply chains, but how will the wealthy countries actually negotiate with raw material rich countries to actually provide them with the raw materials, but say, no, we will actually from now on add the value to the raw materials. We just want your raw materials, but we will actually now produce them ourselves. I mean, how will, I have in the background, I've picked that because I anticipated to some extent in the background, I have a very large port in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, where a lot of car parts are actually being produced. Now, what are we going to do with African or Asian countries that very much depend on manufacturing? I mean, we can always say, well, you know, that's not our problem. We need to now start to produce in Europe. But if we estimate the 40 to 80 million climate change refugees that are coming toward us, and if we add to that economic refugees, how are we going to deal with that from a global perspective? So I'm exaggerating a little bit to give a counterpoint to a vision of a happier, smaller, more contained way of producing and consuming. And I do this expressively to maybe have Patrick and Dorothea respond to this, and then I'm very much looking forward to also to some of the questions that we will receive from our audience. Patrick, do you want to go first?
Okay, is that okay, Dorothy? Yeah. Good. No, well done, Max. So, yeah. So we're not, in one way, like, just to say, I don't think we're naive in the sense that, and I don't think the UN is naive. I think one of the first things Guterres did, and a lot of people did, was sign a petition for peace, because, you know, everyone saw with a global pandemic that everyone was going introverted. They were going in state. They were going on their own. And the geopolitics between China, and like, they could see where this was going, and they could see that we could be on a pathway to war, because that's what happened after the Spanish flu, right? That's so people understand that. So first thing is this kind of a passionate plea, you know, that look, we have to go on a pathway to solidarity and to peace. That we cannot let this escalate into conflict, right? Now, the second part is, given that we can stop that, which is not an easy thing, and I think it's quite interesting the way the SDGs, SDG 16, and the sort of recommendations it has for ensuring a sustainable peace, I think there's interesting. We could have a whole session on that. But, you know, let's then talk about the strains and fraction in society and economy. So I absolutely agree with, I mean, it is true what Dorothy is saying, is that, you know, within nation states, and I can only speak for Ireland, you know, different countries are different, but we have had partnerships, particularly in the medical side now, between the private and public sector that we never really had. We've had a solidarity with society, and we've had science up front taking the lead and making the recommendations, you know what I mean? And we've always called for this kind of whole of society, informed by science and led by government. I mean, that's what the SDG agenda wants, okay? And we want it globally, but we kind of got it low at a national level. And of course, you know, just isolating that on its own, I think that's what Dorothy was doing, was kind of saying, well, you know what, there are some benefits to that. Like, we're already seeing, you know, social, you know, like, obviously with people dying, it's ridiculous that we would all sacrifice any of these benefits for people not to have died. So that's, but we're just stepping back from it. We're saying maybe we could organize ourselves differently. Now, the one with the global supply chains, and just to get at your point, and I think you're very right. If, say, Ireland, like, we have 69% of our land in the herd, right? We have about 9 million cows and 4.5 million people, right? And we export mainly animals, you know, in terms of food and drink, intensive animal farming. We import about 14 billion worths of food from all over the world, particularly Africa and other countries, right? Now, obviously, McDonald's has shut down, so there's nowhere to sell the meat. And then we're also seeing there's problems in our supply chains into the supermarkets. So obviously it doesn't take a huge brainiac to creative destruction to go, why aren't we using the land to grow our own food? Like, why don't we actually somehow with the government have an, you know, reallocation of land use, because we can be really productive at growing seasonal food in Ireland, like particularly arable land. Like this is what we used to do in the past, right? And of course, you know, people would look at this, you know, and they might go, you know what, that would create more jobs in the countryside. That actually would mean we'd be more nutritious, you know, more nutrition for the people. That would mean we're more food secure. Like we wouldn't be you know, we can run out of food after 3 days. That happened in a snowstorm a few years ago. So this is very possible, right? So we're very aware of this, right? With the ports and transportation, right? Now, the problem with us doing that and doing it with government, and it is a transition, and it's not an easy one at all, very political transition, right? So the meat farmers here, like the French, like they've got a big lobby group, probably the second biggest in the EU, you know, the IFA, the Irish Farm Association, they have their own agencies, they own the land after all, like they're going to fight to stop that sort of transformation. But let's say we compensate them. Let's say we see a medium to long-term future where everyone's a winner. Now, that will have knock-on effects in Africa, because suddenly all the countries that were supplying all the fruit and vegetables, and even though there's only a little bit of manufacturing and processing, suddenly you'd be cutting off those markets. And then you could trace that back to quite a lot of poverty and problems there. But of course, you can have that conversation in Africa too, because I think what I'm hearing is land grabs, specialization of production, soil degradation, flooding, etc., going into supply chains of coffee, etc. Why are they exporting food at a high price when people are dying of hunger and they can't get access to food because the food is too expensive? This is why we have famines, etc. But again, if the market in Europe is gone, well, they could say, well, why not have a market at home? Like, why not suddenly look at our capabilities and to create a market which is much more sustainable on the African continent, right? But as you're pointing out, though, like that transition in both the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere is very painful, right? And you really wonder what government unilaterally has any incentive to do this, like, you know. And I think this is where I'm trying to get at. When we actually give I'm sure this is true for Dorothy too, a vision for the future. It's theoretical, it's naive, but it is somebody screaming, we have the technology and the ability to do things differently, right? And we need to get together as a global society, because we all need that, you know, the water, we need ocean health. We need to stop climate change. We need to think about our food systems in a global way, nutritious systems. We need to understand how we affect each other socially and in every other dimension, right? And the only way to do that is somehow, even with the big multinationals who are probably 20 times bigger than governments, we need to get them into a room and say, this is in nobody's interest to go down the path we're going down. Apart from war, this is going down huge inequality, huge famine, huge problems down the road. And we can all do better than this. And we all want to come out winners. We all want to make money, and we all want, but the point is it needs dialogue and a conversation and some, let's say, social contracting, environmental contracting at a kind of a global level, which we've never seen before. But unfortunately, if we don't do it, there's a problem, right? So, you know, humanity has to respond to that. And you're quite right to say, God, you're naive thinking that will happen at a national level. No, but history is absolutely on your side. Even recent history is absolutely on your side. But that doesn't mean the daydreamers can't come out and go, actually, this is just the will of the people. I mean, this is as simple as that, you know, but somehow we find it difficult.
Dora, do you have a quick response?
Yeah, I would like to comment very quickly. I think COVID-19 is a wake up, and people and companies are listening now. And I think society and business is slowly seeing and feeling that regional supply chains are more reliable. And I think you can create a willingness to pay more. And we see that already in Germany, for example, for the green hydrogen business models. The people are willing to pay more for something that is good, that is green, that is sustainable. But therefore, I think you have to connect the price and the prices with a good storyline. The people has to feel what they are doing good. And yeah, and I just wanted to mention some examples from the creative power of destruction we already see in Germany. In America, it's very common that you pay everything, just even a Coke or something with your credit card. And Germany was a payment developing country so far, as we can see. And now we see the difference and the change. You can everywhere now you can pay by credit card, and it wasn't possible before. So we see already some disruptions and changes in business models, and I think we will see it in the future more if we use it as a window of opportunity.
I think we may just have time for one question. There's not that many questions, but there is Mary Mayenfish is asking, is commenting, here in Switzerland, we have some huge multinationals and we are trying to intergovernment legislation on human rights and business, so that Swiss and Swiss-based companies are held responsible and can be sued in Swiss courts. And what about taxes and correct tax structures? I think this is, maybe that's a very interesting point about how supply chains and taxation may actually relate and possibly automatically reduce the complexity of supply chain if we actually think about tax and tax implications. Does any one of you two want to connect supply chains and SDGs to taxation?
Yeah, no, you know, obviously, when you do environmental economics, Pignovian taxes are one of the first policy instruments you talk about, and it is interesting. Like when you're looking at Paris Agreement, and to me that's very much a country level reduction in carbon emissions coming from companies who are located in that country, and then if you somehow were to put down regulation on supply chains or regulation on consumption patterns, like that actually, you know, the benefits of that would be down the value chain, and other countries would free ride on those carbon reductions. Actually, you wouldn't get any credit for the action you've taken. But one sort of recommendation is like, where should the carbon be counted? And maybe where you declare your taxes, you know, so maybe that's where the carbon should be counted. And if then, you know, you can actually, you know, tax that if you want, or you can you know, you can incentivize it so that you can make a transformation in your supply chain. So it's interesting, like it's not just where companies land or where their operations or subsidiaries or their suppliers land in another country, and that taxes have this ability. People in the end declare their taxes, it tends to be over Ireland actually for a lot of industries. But this is your moment to go, okay, you're declaring your value added, your global value added in our country, but that's full of footprints, let's say environmental and other types of footprints. And, you know, maybe you don't want to punish them, but maybe you want to incentivize them, or you want to do something with the tax and actually start doing your accounting and accountability, if you like, or incentives for transformation, or incentives to get, you know, to do different things like sustainable development reporting or something. To think of it that way, you know. So so I think it's very interesting. And I know the Swiss, a lot of companies, like a lot of people would attack my talk and they'd say, you're a globalist, you're a communist, you are like, you're looking for big global government, you're looking, you know. And the reality, that's not true, right? Because the reality is that people are in companies, people are in governments, people are in societies, etc., right? I am fully happy for the, you know, for the big global companies in their corporate in the way they set up their governance, their boards, in the way they do their reporting, their shareholding, in the way they do their planning and their investments, to actually say, you know, we want to develop medium to long-term markets. We want to do deals with governments and with society that really gives us this longevity and advantage. And to actually go, yeah, let's have an ability to do that at a transnational level. Let's actually be able to sign those incentive compatible contracts. Let's just do that, because a lot of companies are realizing this. I mean, like this, the way we're going at the moment is we're all out of business. Humanity and everything about humanity is out of business within 50 years if we don't get our act together. So I'm quite happy for, you know, the UN to allow corporate members. I'm quite happy that they sign up to the Charter. I'm quite happy that they start to be an important member of not just, you know, the Economic and Social Council, but also maybe even subcommittees of the Security Council, because we know private companies are very involved in the monitoring and security and, you know, and all these sort of things as well, right? So it's just where people are, they have to get into a room together and they have to charter their own destiny. And I think that's what the SDGs is all about. My only thing today, though, is, you know, I'm a bit concerned that we talk nationally about this too much, when in reality, we've got to talk internationally. We can't stay away from this, because as we stay away from that from a policy or even a theoretical or academic perspective, in the background, these guys, you know, in their supply chains, are doing an incredible amount of work, and, you know, maybe for good, maybe not for good, but we're not talking about them. And that's dangerous, basically. Yeah.
Maybe my last question. We have only time for one more for Doro. I pick up what Paul Walsh just talked about. We have to actually think internationally. If I combine this with Schumpeter's creative destruction, what advice would you have with regard to the opportunity of COVID-19? What advice would you have to, let us say, lower middle income countries such as India or South Africa in the background? So how do you see South Africa or India benefiting from the impact that COVID-19 has on supply chains or the SDGs?
I think it's easier to say how the Western world could benefit from that. But if I have a look to the Global South, and if I have a look to the investment programs from the governments, which are right now setting up, and if they are getting more into a sustainable solution, I think we can use the chance right now to change the systems and the value change there. Mm-hmm. So if we take the right criteria how investment programs should compete in the Global South, for example, which kind of I made the example for SDG 7, then we need more electricity decentralized. So we need more money, of course, and that could be one point. If we have green investment programs.
Okay. I'm afraid we need at least another hour or two more, but we are at the end. We're actually already 8 minutes over time. I will leave Matthias Burkhardt and MDPI to close the event.
Yes, so thank you very much to all panelists, Doro, Patrick, Max. It was very interesting, and we will answer the questions which have not been discussed right now later, and we will put it on the website. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much, and we will prepare another webinar, and it will be on fake news, fake facts during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.